She was 22 years old, and she owned nothing but the clothes on her back, a carpet bag that held a single change of dress, and $14.30. Every coin of it counted 3 times over on the seat of a westbound stage. The man who had seen to that poverty was her uncle, Harlan Pruitt, who had signed her father's name on documents he had no right to touch and quietly swallowed an inheritance that had never belonged to him. She arrived in the railroad town of Callow Bend, Wyoming Territory, in the autumn of 1887 with no family, no rooms, no prospects, and no one who knew her name. It was on the second morning, standing in a field of early frost behind the switching yard, that she saw it. A decommissioned railroad car, Union Pacific livery faded to the color of old brick, sitting alone on a stub of an used track, a hand-lettered sign nailed to its door reading $5 or best offer. The station master called it worthless. The freight agent called her foolish. She called it shelter and paid the $5 with fingers she had to force open from the coin. What none of them could have known, what she herself would not know for weeks, was that sealed beneath the floorboards of that abandoned car lay a hidden compartment, and inside it, the documentation that would not merely restore what was taken from her, but rewrite the entire history of the Pruitt family line and return a stolen legacy to the people it had always rightly belonged to. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Nora Calloway. If you are watching from a place that feels forgotten or passed over, leave us a word in the comments. We want to know you are out there. There is a particular kind of strength that does not announce itself, that does not stand in doorways with its arms wide, demanding to be noticed. It grows quietly in the margins of harder lives, in kitchens where the fire goes low before the biscuits are done, in fields where the row is longer than the light, in houses where love was expressed not in softness, but in steadiness. Nora Calloway grew up inside that kind of strength, and she learned it the way most lasting things are learned, not by being taught it directly, but by watching someone else carry it without complaint. Her father, Thomas Calloway, had been a surveyor by trade and a reader by deep and private inclination. He had come to the Wyoming Territory in 1862 as a young man hired by the Union Pacific Railroad to walk the land ahead of the rails and measure what could be measured, and he had stayed because the land, in his own words, was too honest to leave. He had married a woman named Ida Marsh in 1863, and they had built a 2-room house on 40 acres outside a small settlement called Prentice Hollow, and in the summer of 1865, Nora was born, the first of what Thomas had hoped would be many children, though Ida's health had narrowed that hope to just the one, and they had poured all of their intention into her accordingly. Thomas Calloway was precise the way surveyors are precise, not coldly, but carefully, with the understanding that a small error at the start compounds itself across miles, and that the land does not forgive imprecision even when the person who made the mistake is kind. He taught Nora to read by the age of 4, to cipher by 6, and to use a transit level by 8, not because he expected her to follow him into his trade, but because he believed a woman who could measure the world had a better chance of standing inside it without being moved against her will. He kept records of everything: receipts for seed, for timber, for labor, letters received and copies of letters sent, land documents in a locked tin box that he kept beneath the floorboard of the bedroom, and which he showed to Nora on the day she turned 13. Spreading the papers on the table and explaining each one with the same care he gave to his surveying notes. The land, he told her, belonged to the Calloways. Not through inheritance alone, but through original purchase, through federal land patent, through 25 years of labor and tax and improvement. He had purchased an additional 60 acres in 1878, bringing the family holdings to an even 100, and those papers too were in the tin box, dated and signed and witnessed by the county recorder in Laramie. Nora listened to all of it, and then she did what her father had trained her to do. She asked to look at the documents herself, and she read every word. Thomas Calloway died in February of 1884, taken by a lung sickness that the winter had worsened past any doctor's correcting, and he left behind a wife in fragile health, a daughter not yet 19, and 100 acres of Wyoming land that was worth considerably more than it had been 20 years prior, because the railroad had come through and the town of Prentice Hollow had grown up around the depot, and land near a railroad was not the same kind of land it had been before. Ida Calloway followed her husband 14 months later, in the spring of 1885, without drama or struggle. She had simply, it seemed, decided that the world had already held her most important reason for being in it, and she released herself from it with the same quiet dignity with which she had lived inside it. Nora was 20 at her mother's death. She was alone on 100 acres that she knew how to work, educated far beyond what the county generally produced in its daughters, possessed of her father's careful habits and her mother's steady hands, and she had every reason, in the spring of 1885, to believe that the difficulty of her life was the kind of difficulty that resolve and patience could eventually correct. She would tend the land. She would pay the taxes. She would find her footing. She was, as Thomas Calloway had tried to make her, a woman who knew how to measure the world. What she did not yet know was that someone else had already been measuring it on her behalf and arriving at very different conclusions. Harlan Pruitt was Thomas Calloway's brother-in-law, the younger brother of Ida, which made him Nora's uncle by a connection that had always been thin and obligatory rather than warm. He had grown up in Missouri and had followed Thomas and Ida west not out of affection, but out of the kind of restless opportunism that moves certain men from place to place the way weather moves, always in search of the conditions most favorable to itself. He had settled in Laramie, worked intermittently as a land agent, and cultivated acquaintances among the county's records office with the patience of a man who understood that usefulness to a bureaucrat was a long-term investment. In the 15 months between Thomas Calloway's death and Ida's, Harlan had visited twice. The first visit, in the spring of 1884, he had spent in what seemed like grief, seated at the kitchen table, offering Ida condolences, helping with the fencing along the east pasture, asking, with what appeared to be practical brotherly concern, whether Thomas had left the property affairs in good order. Ida, whose health had already begun its quiet decline, had shown him the tin box. The second visit, in January of 1885, was briefer. He helped Ida with the woodpile and left before supper, and Nora, who had been in town that afternoon, did not see him go. She did not think much of it. She was occupied with her mother's worsening condition and with the 100 small urgencies of a farm being run by one pair of hands. She thought about it considerably more in the summer of 1886, when a notice arrived from the Laramie County Recorder's office informing her that the property at Prentice Hollow, both the original 40 acres and the 60-acre addition, had been transferred by deed signed by Thomas Calloway in 1883, prior to his death, to one Harlan Pruitt, and that said property had since been sold to a land speculation company out of Denver, and that Nora Calloway, as no legal heir of record to any remaining estate, had 60 days to vacate. She did not vacate in 60 days. She hired the only lawyer in Prentice Hollow, a man named Abe Dunnick, who charged $30 for a consultation and told her, with genuine regret, that the deed appeared, on its surface, valid. It bore Thomas Calloway's signature, a notary stamp, and the date of October 1883. He told her that challenging it would require proof of forgery, which would require an expert examiner, which would cost money she did not have, and time the court would not grant her. He told her he was sorry. He meant it. It did not change anything. She spent the winter of 1886 with a family named Ostrander who let her board in their attic in exchange for work, and she spent that winter doing something her father had trained her to do instinctively, even when she was too heartsick to know she was doing it. She was measuring. She was recording. She was writing down everything she remembered about the documents in the tin box, the dates, the witness names, the specific language of the land patent, the way her father's handwriting looked when it was his, compressed and square and leaning slightly left, against the cramped and rounded signature on the fraudulent deed, which she had seen just long enough in the lawyer's office to know was wrong. But knowing a thing and proving it are different instruments, and the winter had not provided her with the proof. By spring of 1887, she had exhausted her savings on board, on the failed legal consultation, and on the bare necessities of staying alive and warm enough to think. She was 22 years old. She had $14.30. And when the Ostrander's eldest son came home from a season of railroad work in the attic room was needed, she picked up her carpetbag and she walked south toward the sound of the switching yard at Callow Bend, because the sound of a railroad was the sound of something still moving, and moving was the only plan she had left. The station master at Callow Bend was a barrel-shaped man named Greeley Foss who wore his authority like a coat 2 sizes too large, constantly adjusting it, perpetually aware of how it fit. He was not a cruel man, but he was an incurious one, which in Nora's experience was often worse. When she asked him about the railroad car on the stub track, he looked at her the way men in certain positions look at women who ask direct questions, with a patience that barely concealed its own impatience. The car, he told her, was a surplus passenger coach, Union Pacific number 114, decommissioned in 1883 after an axle failure outside of Rawlins. It had been towed to the Callow Bend yard as a temporary equipment shed, and then simply forgotten, the way things at the edges of larger systems are forgotten when the center of the system has more urgent needs. The roof had been patched twice with tin. The windows on one side were boarded. The interior, Foss said, with a dismissive wave, was in no condition anyone would call comfortable, if she was thinking what he suspected she was thinking. She told him she was not thinking of comfort. She was thinking of shelter and of the $5 sign. He blinked. He looked at the car, and then at her, and he performed a brief internal calculation that had something to do with the cost of hauling the car to scrap, and something to do with the $20 he had spent on a new saddle last month, and something to do, perhaps, with the fact that Nora Calloway's eyes contained a quality that made certain kinds of dismissal difficult to sustain. He took her $5. He gave her a receipt, written in pencil on the back of a freight manifest, that said the car and its contents, such as they were hereby the property of one Nora Calloway of, and here he paused, Callow Bend, Wyoming territory. She walked across the frozen grass of the switching yard to the car and stood at its door for a long moment before she opened it. Inside, the air was cold and dense with the smell of old wood, iron, and something else beneath that, a dry, faintly papery smell she could not immediately name. The car was approximately 40 feet long and 9 feet wide. Its interior stripped of most of its original passenger fittings, though the brass rail along the luggage shelf was still there, and 2 of the original bench seats remained bolted to the floor near the far end. Someone had left a cast-iron stove in the center of the car, small, squat, with a rusted flue that disappeared through a hole cut in the roof, and beside it, a stack of split pine that had dried to the density of stone. She spent the rest of that first afternoon making the car habitable. She swept the floor with a broom she borrowed from the station. She found that the tin patches on the roof held. She coaxed a fire from the pine and discovered that the stove, for all its rust, drew remarkably well. She hung her spare dress from the brass rail, set her carpet bag beneath the nearest bench seat, and sat on the floor in the warmth of the stove with her knees drawn to her chest, and allowed herself, for exactly the length of time it took the wood to catch fully, to feel the full weight of where she was and how she had come to be there. Then she got up, because that was what Thomas Calloway had raised her to do. She began that evening to examine the car the way her father had examined everything, systematically, from one end to the other, with her hands as much as her eyes. The floor was her particular interest, because old railroad cars were built with dead space between the structural floor and the finished one, and she had spent enough time around the trade to know that this space was sometimes used for utility storage, for tool caches, for things the original owners had meant to come back for. She tapped along the planks with her knuckle, listening for the difference between solid and hollow. She found it on the third evening. A section of floor near the forward wall of the car, approximately 4 feet square, returned a sound distinctly different from the rest. She worked at it with a pry bar she had traded 2 days of station yard sweeping to acquire, and the section lifted cleanly on a hidden hinge, revealing a compartment roughly 18 inches deep, running the width of the car. It was empty except for a single item, a flat wooden case, the kind used for drafting instruments or navigational tools, lashed with a small brass clip. The case was wrapped in oilcloth, tied at 2 points with waxed twine. She sat back on her heels and looked at it for a long time in the light of her oil lantern. Then she untied the twine. Inside the oilcloth, the wooden case was dry, perfectly, improbably dry, sealed as it had been from the air by whoever had wrapped it, and for however long it had been in that dark space. The brass clip opened with a pressure that suggested it had been engineered with some precision. The case itself was lined in green baize, and it held, not instruments, but documents, a stack of them, folded carefully to fit the case's dimensions, each one separated from the next by a thin sheet of wax paper. She took them out one by one and spread them on the floor around her in the lantern light, and she read them in the slow, thorough way her father had taught her to read anything that contained numbers or names or dates, without assumption, from beginning to end. The first document was a land grant, federal issue, dated June of 1871, signed by a United States Land Office commissioner, granting 240 acres in Teton County, Wyoming territory, to one Augustine Varela, in recognition of his service as a civilian guide and interpreter during the survey expeditions of 1868 and 1869, and in confirmation of his prior homestead claim on the same land. The language was formal, specific, and unmistakable in its intent. Nora had never heard the name Augustine Varela, but she read the document twice, and then she set it aside and took up the next one. The second document was a letter, handwritten in Spanish on one side and English on the other, dated 1879, and addressed to someone identified only as R. at a Union Pacific freight office in Cheyenne. The English translation, clearly done by the same hand, described a situation Nora began to understand only as she read further. Augustine Varela, the letter explained, had been persuaded in 1873 to sign documents transferring his land grant to a holding company organized under a name Nora did not immediately recognize, the Meridian Land and Survey Company of Laramie. He had signed them under the belief, communicated to him by an English-speaking agent, that he was signing a lease arrangement, not a conveyance. He had not been shown a translation. He had not been given time to seek one. The land grant, once transferred, had been dissolved into the holding company's assets and sold in parcels to 3 separate buyers over the following years. The third document was a ledger page, a single sheet torn neatly from a bound book, listing the parcels sold from the original Varela grant and the names of the buyers. The third entry on that page, dated October of 1875, listed 60 acres in the southern portion of the original grant, sold to one Thomas Calloway of Prentice Hollow, Wyoming Territory. Nora sat very still for a long moment. She reached for the fourth document. It was a letter in English, dated 1881, from a Laramie attorney named Gerald Mace to someone whose name had been cut from the top of the letter, deliberately, cleanly, with a sharp instrument. The letter referenced a recent meeting in which the recipient had inquired about the legal standing of certain parcels in the Wyoming Territory formerly associated with the Meridian Land and Survey Company. The attorney's response was carefully worded, but its meaning was not obscure. The original land grant to Augustine Varela, Mace wrote, had been improperly transferred under circumstances that, if examined by a federal land court, would likely render the conveyance void and restore title to Varela's heirs. The Meridian Company's records, Mace noted, were incomplete, but he had in his possession certain documents that had come to him through a source he declined to name, which established the fraudulent nature of the original transfer beyond reasonable legal challenge. The fifth and final document in the case was a sworn affidavit, dated 1882, signed by Augustine Varela himself. Elderly, the handwriting suggests, though firm, stating in both Spanish and English that he had never willingly relinquished his land grant, that he had been deceived by an agent who had translated the documents falsely, and that he wished, in writing and under oath, for the record to reflect the truth of what had been done to him and to his family. Nora read all of this twice. Then she set the documents back in their order on the wax paper, closed the case, and sat in the warmth of the iron stove while the fire settled down to coals, and she thought. The Meridian Land and Survey Company of Laramie. She had heard that name before. She had heard it in the lawyer Dunnock's office, in the same breath as the deed that had taken her father's land. Meridian had bought Thomas Calloway's 100 acres from Harlan Pruitt, and now, in her hands, she held evidence that Meridian itself had been built on land fraudulently taken from a man who had guided surveyors through the same territory her father had helped to measure in the very same years, on the very same railroads whose decommissioned equipment now sheltered her from the Wyoming cold. She did not sleep that night. She was measuring. By the third week of November, Nora had learned the following. Augustine Varela had died in 1884 and was buried in a Catholic cemetery on the outskirts of a small settlement called Palomas Creek, 30 miles northeast of Callow Bend. He had left behind a daughter named Clemencia Varela Reyes, who was 40 years old, married to a man who ran a small freighting operation, and who had grown up on the land her father lost, and had spent the better part of her adult life believing, as her father had been made to believe, that there was nothing to be done about it. Nora learned this from the postmaster at Callow Bend, who knew the Palomas Creek settlement, and who was one of those rare men in bureaucratic positions whose curiosity was stronger than his discretion. She also learned that Gerald Mace, the Laramie attorney whose letter was among the documents, was still practicing, that the federal land court for the Wyoming Territory was convened twice yearly in Cheyenne, and that the Meridian Land and Survey Company, the holding company that had purchased the fraudulently transferred Varela grant, parceled and resold it, and then purchased Nora's family land from Harlan Pruitt, was, in fact, still actively operating, its principals quietly known in Laramie legal and political circles as men of means and influence and very limited accountability. This last fact was the one that gave her pause. Because what she held in the case was powerful, she could see that clearly, but power on paper and power in practice are not the same instrument. And she was a 22-year-old woman living in a decommissioned railroad car who had already watched one lawyer explain why legal justice was not always available to the people who deserved it most. She had no money for a second lawyer. She had no connections in the federal court system. She had only the documents, her father's training, and the long habit of thinking carefully before she acted. It was the station agent's bookkeeper, a tired woman named Hortense Gill who worked 6 days a week in a room barely larger than a wardrobe, and who had taken a quiet liking to Nora, who told her about a man named Colton Prue. He was, Hortense said, a former land claims investigator for the federal government who had retired to Callow Bend 3 years prior and now spent his days writing letters to his congressman and his evenings at the depot reading newspapers from back east. He was, Hortense added, the most irritating man she had ever met and also the most honest, and if what Nora was describing was what Hortense thought it was describing, then Colton Prue was the person to find. Colton Prue was 64, lean as a fence post, and possessed of a manner that suggested he had spent a career listening to people tell him things they hoped he wouldn't verify, and had verified all of them anyway. He listened to Nora for 45 minutes without interruption. He examined the documents for another 30. Then he sat back in his chair at the depot bench and said, in the careful, measured tone of a man who had trained himself out of excitement long ago, that what she had was sufficient for a federal land fraud claim on behalf of Varela's heirs, and very possibly sufficient, as a secondary matter, to open a criminal inquiry into the Meridian Company's practices, which would, as a consequence, bring scrutiny to every transaction Meridian had conducted in the past 15 years, including its purchase of the Callaway land from Harlan Pruitt. He told her she would need to go to Cheyenne. He told her the court sat in February. He told her he would write the letter of introduction himself, because he knew the land court's chief examiner personally, and because what had been done to Augustine Varela was, in Prue's own words, precisely the kind of thing he had spent 30 years trying to correct and had not always managed to, and he intended to see it corrected now. Nora asked him why he would do this for a woman he had met less than 2 hours before. He looked at her for a moment with eyes that had seen a great deal of the territory's history and said, simply, that the documents were the documents, and the law was the law, and that was the end of it as far as he was concerned. She left his office and walked back across the frost-hard yard to the railroad car and sat in the quiet of it with the oilcloth case in her lap and allowed herself, carefully, to feel the specific texture of what was happening. Not hope, exactly, because hope was a word she had learned to use sparingly, but something adjacent to it, something more architectural. A sense of foundation beneath ground that had for a long time felt uncertain. The difficulty came, as she had partially anticipated it would, from two directions simultaneously. The first was Greeley Foss, the station master. It had come to Foss's attention, through the imprecise but efficient mechanisms by which small-town information traveled, that Nora Callaway was in possession of documents relating to the Meridian Land Company, and Foss, who held a modest investment in Meridian through a cousin in Laramie, arrived at the railroad car on a Tuesday morning with the expression of a man who had prepared a great deal of what he intended to say and trusted none of it. He told her, in careful language, that he had been reconsidering the terms of the sale, that the receipt he had issued had perhaps been issued in haste, and that the car's status as railroad property might be more complicated than he had initially represented, and that it would perhaps be in everyone's best interest if she made other arrangements for her accommodation and returned the documents, which he referred to as the items in question, to the yard's safekeeping while the matter was sorted out. Nora listened to all of this without expression. Then she showed him the receipt. She reminded him that it had been signed by him, in his capacity as station master, witnessed by the freight agent who had been standing nearby, and that the phrase contents such as they were had been his own language. She told him that she had already written to the federal land court in Cheyenne, that her letter had included a description of the documents and a summary of their content, and that the examiner's office had been in contact with Colton Prue, who had confirmed receipt. She told him that the documents were therefore already, in the most practical sense, part of an active federal proceeding, and that any interference with them or with her would be a matter of considerable interest to that proceeding. Greeley Foss left without further discussion. The second difficulty was more human and more complicated. Word had reached Harlan Pruitt in Laramie that a woman named Nora Callaway was conducting inquiries in Callow Bend relating to the Meridian Company and to certain land transactions in Teton County. He arrived at Callow Bend on the Thursday of that same week, having come by the morning train, and he appeared at the door of the railroad car in his good suit coat and the expression of a man who has decided that direct confrontation is, under certain circumstances, the most efficient form of management. He told her she was making a mistake. He told her that the land sale had been legal, that her father had discussed it with him in the months before his illness and had expressed his wishes clearly, and that the deed, whatever questions she might wish to raise about it, had been verified by the county recorder in Laramie. He spoke calmly and with the practiced fluency of a man who had said these things before. He said he was willing to offer her a sum. He named $200, in recognition of whatever difficulty the transition had caused her, as a gesture of family feeling, provided she was willing to step back from this misunderstanding before it caused harm to relationships that could not easily be repaired. Nora looked at him, at this man who had signed her father's name on a document her father had never seen, who had taken 100 acres from a grieving 19-year-old, who had forced her to spend a winter in someone else's attic counting coins. And she felt something that was not anger, exactly. It was quieter than anger. It was the feeling of a surveyor who has walked the line twice and knows precisely where the boundary sits, regardless of what anyone else wishes to claim about it. She told him she was not interested in $200. She told him she was not interested in any sum he had to offer. She told him that the matter was before the federal land court and that she had nothing further to say to him on the subject. He left on the afternoon train. She watched it go from the door of the railroad car and then went inside and added coals to the stove and sat at the small table she had constructed from lumber salvaged from a collapsed section of the yard fence and wrote a long, careful letter to Clemencia Varela Reyes in Palomas Creek, explaining who she was, what she had found, and what she intended to do with it. The federal land court convened in Cheyenne on the 14th of February, 1888. Nora arrived with Colton Prue, with the oilcloth case, and with Clemencia Varela Reyes, who had made the journey from Palomas Creek in a borrowed buckboard with her husband and her eldest son, all three of them dressed in their best clothes and wearing the expressions of people who have been told, for a very long time, that something cannot be done, and who have not entirely stopped believing it. The examiner's name was Whitmore Haas. He was a compact, precise man who read the documents in the same methodical way Nora's father had taught her to read anything important, from beginning to end, without assumption, noting every date and name and point of connection. He asked questions that were specific and technical. He asked Nora how she had come to possess the documents. He asked Colton Prue about the chain of custody. He asked Clemencia about her father, about the land he had lost, about what she remembered of the years before and after the transfer. Clemencia spoke slowly and without drama, in a mix of English and Spanish that her husband translated where needed, and she described her father, a man who had walked the Wyoming Territory in all its seasons, who had spoken 3 languages and navigated 4 mountain passes, who had been repaid for his service to the United States government with a grant that had been taken from him by the same civilization he had helped to build a path through. She spoke without bitterness, because she had been carrying this story for too long to afford the weight of bitterness, but she spoke with the particular precision of grief that has been held carefully for many years. The examiner's ruling took 6 weeks to come. When it did, it was thorough and unambiguous. The original transfer of the Varela land grant was declared void on grounds of fraud. The affidavit, Varela's own sworn words, was determined to be central and conclusive. The 240 acres were restored to the Varela heirs, represented by Clemencia Varela Reyes. The Meridian Land and Survey Company was ordered to appear before the court to account for all transactions stemming from the fraudulent acquisition. Criminal referrals were made to the Territorial Prosecutor's Office for 3 named individuals connected to Meridian's founding. Harlan Pruitt was among them. His purchase of the Callaway land, acquired, the court found, through his own forgery of Thomas Callaway's signature on a deed fabricated after Callaway's death, was unwound by a separate proceeding that spring, in which the Meridian Company, eager to demonstrate cooperation with the federal investigation, surrendered its interest in the Prentice Hollow property rather than face additional exposure. The land was returned to Nora Callaway by court order in April of 1888. The 100 acres her father had bought with 25 years of work, the same ground where he had walked his survey lines in the early mornings with the transit level on his shoulder, was hers. She did not move back immediately. She stayed the spring in the railroad car while the farmhouse at Prentice Hollow was aired and repaired. A neighbor who had kept watch on the property through the Meridian years had maintained it better than she had dared to hope. She worked the station yard through April, saving what she could. She wrote 3 letters to Clemencia Varela Reyes, and received 3 letters in return, and the correspondence between them had the quality of something that would not soon end. On the morning she left Callow Bend, she stood at the door of the railroad car for a long time before she locked it. She had come to feel for that 40-foot wooden box something that was not sentiment, exactly, but was adjacent to it, a recognition of what a thing can be when it is all that is available, and what a person can build inside inadequate shelter when she is determined enough. She had organized a legal action of federal scope in that car. She had written the letters that had reached Clemencia Varela Reyes in that car. She had slept there, and thought there, and recovered herself there, and she was not the same person who had paid $5 for it in the frost of October. She arranged with Greeley Foss, a quieter, more careful man than he had been 6 months prior, for the car to remain on its stub of track. She had an idea, she told him, that she would explain in time. He did not ask questions. The idea took 3 years to fully realize, but that, she would say later, was appropriate. The best things generally did. By the summer of 1891, the railroad car at Callow Bend had been restored, with the help of Clemencia's husband and 2 of his workers, from a derelict equipment shed into something the territory had not previously had, a small lending library and reading room, open to anyone who came to the station, funded in part by a donation from a group of Cheyenne attorneys who had followed the Varela land case with considerable interest and who had, in the quiet way that legal communities sometimes right their own wrongs, contributed a modest sum in the name of the late Augustine Varela. The shelves were built from the same lumber Nora had salvaged for her table. The reading lamp on the corner table was her father's oil lantern, cleaned and fitted with a new wick. The brass rail along the luggage shelf still ran the length of the car and held, in addition to the books, a framed copy of the federal land court ruling in the matter of Varela versus Meridian, because Clemencia had asked for it to be there, and because Nora had agreed that things which have been made right deserve to be seen. The hidden compartment was still there, beneath the floorboards. They had debated, she and Clemencia, whether to display it or to close it back up. In the end, they left it as it was, accessible, with a small hinge door fitted over the original opening and a handwritten card beside it that said, simply, "This is where it was found." Some visitors understood immediately. Some did not. Both were welcome. Harlan Pruitt entered a guilty plea to the territorial court in the autumn of 1888 on the reduced charge of filing a false instrument, and paid a fine that represented roughly a third of what he had profited from the Callaway sale. He left Laramie the following spring and did not return. Nora received no portion of the fine. She had not expected any. The 100 acres were enough. The land was enough. The land had always been enough, if it had been allowed to remain hers. We began this story in a frost-gray field behind a switching yard, with a young woman counting $14.30 and looking at a sign that said $5 or best offer, and we told you that something sealed inside that abandoned car would change her life and restore a community, and we kept that promise, because she kept it first, which is why we are here to tell it. Nora Callaway did not find a gold vein or a cache of money. She found something older and more durable than currency. She found evidence of a wrong that had been carefully recorded by people who knew it was wrong and believed, in spite of everything, that a record honestly kept is never entirely wasted. Augustine Varela had made his affidavit in 1882 and placed it in an oilcloth case inside a wooden box in the locked compartment of a railroad car that had been sitting in the Wyoming frost for 4 years when Nora bought it. He had trusted, without knowing it, that someone would eventually do the measuring carefully enough to find what he had left. Thomas Callaway had spent his career believing that a small error at the start compounds itself across miles, and that precision in the beginning is a form of generosity to whoever comes after. Both men had been right. Their belief in careful record-keeping had reached across the years and the cold and the indifference of chance to find a young woman who had been raised to read every word from beginning to end, who had been left with nothing but the habits her father gave her, and who had been stubborn enough, or faithful enough, or simply determined enough, to apply those habits to a 40-foot wooden box that everyone else had written off as worthless. The land at Prentice Hollow is still there. The railroad car is still there. Clemencia Varela Reyes's granddaughter sat in it once, years later, and read. We like to think about that. We like to think about what it means to find value in the discarded, to look carefully at what the world has passed over, and to understand that forgotten is not the same as worthless, and that lost is not the same as gone. We are grateful, as always, that you chose to spend this time with us, with Nora, with Augustine, with Clemencia, with all of them who did not give up on the record being found. If this story moved something in you, we would ask you to share it with one person you think needs to hear it tonight. And before you go, we want to leave you with this. What is a time in your own life when you found genuine worth in something or someone that others had dismissed or written off entirely? Leave it in the comments. We read every one. Until next time, stay close.